You get one opportunity with everything on the line, including your life. Which 5 players in the history of basketball are you choosing to save your life? It's a question players and legends of the game have been talking about since the beginning of time. However, it's an entirely nuanced debate. Are we going position by position? Can we just choose 5 random players and assign them to any position? Because positions are an interesting point to consider when objectively naming the all-time starting 5. I'll explain why towards the end of the video. Back in 2020, Shaquille O'Neal, arguably the greatest big man in NBA history, took to social media to post his all-time starting 5. He said, "I don't care what none of y'all say. Ain't nobody beating this team in a 7-game series." But here's what's interesting about Shaq's starting 5. He has one player who would be categorized as a true big man, and that would be himself. And on top of that, he has 3 shooting guards with Kobe, MJ, and Allen Iverson. While most NBA fans would consider LeBron an elite facilitator and a point forward by nature, there isn't a true point guard on that list, which is against most people's ideology when choosing their own all-time starting 5. Now, I have to be completely honest. Any lineup with MJ, Kobe, and LeBron is going to be close to impossible to dethrone. So I can see why Shaq sounded like he'd be willing to bet his life savings that his team would triumph over any lineup ever. But allow me to do you one better, because while Shaq's list didn't take into account positions and is honestly just more of a combination of talent he feels that would probably work best with his game, what Charles Barkley did with his own list presents more question marks than a med school admission exam. In his backcourt, he had Michael Jordan, understandable, a highly questionable pick in Oscar Robertson, which is a little surprising. But then I remembered that Charles Barkley actually had the audacity to call Oscar Robertson the 2nd greatest player of all time. The Big O is a legend and deserves to be recognized as one, but the 2nd greatest player ever? Nah, that ain't it. But continuing with Barkley's list. So it starts in terms of him going position by position, but then he hits us with the ultimate curveball, going with Bill Russell, Wilt Chamberlain, and Kareem Abdul-Jabbar. Like, what about the wing players? But I'd be lying to you if I told you that simply choosing players without regard to position is the only challenge or nuance in this age-old debate, because the biggest thing that has caused such a discrepancy between both former and active NBA superstars is their bias towards their era and towards their favorite players. Sure, it makes sense that a player wants to choose guys that he saw play and players that became his favorite athletes, but sometimes being biased is a hell of a drug. One of the many glaring examples of this is Dr. J and the 5 players he listed as his members of his NBA all-time starting 5. And as a quick spoiler, in 2013, Dr. J said that his all-time starting 5 would have been the same since he was 14 years old. The 5 he listed were Bill Russell, Wilt Chamberlain, Elgin Baylor, Jerry West, and Oscar Robertson. I could already hear you in the comments. Yes, these are Hall of Fame talents and legends of the sport, but he left Michael Jordan off that list. Yeah. Then, in 2021, Dr. J tried to right his wrongs. He amended his previous all-time starting 5 with an entirely different lineup. Larry Bird, Kareem, Karl Malone, Magic Johnson, and yes, this time he included Michael Jordan. And speaking of the GOAT himself, he too weighed in with his own all-time starting 5. But again, with some strings attached, he starts with 2 of his ex-teammates, Scottie Pippen and James Worthy. He then pairs up with Hakeem and Magic Johnson. 2 very respectable choices with Magic and Hakeem, but with all due respect, neither Pippen nor Worthy should actually be on an objective all-time starting 5 team. Hey, he won 6 titles and 1 national championship. Can you really blame him? Well, I mean, yeah, but really no. Anyway, here's where the entire discussion gets a whole lot more interesting. It might be the biggest point to ponder when picking your all-time starting 5, without favoritism or bias towards any player or towards any era, and not completely forgetting about positions. If we think about all-time starting 5s more logistically and just practically, it goes back to what I was saying earlier in the video, choosing by positions or choosing positionless. So let's say, for example, you actually did need to assemble a team of 5 players to save your life so that you could live to see another day. Are you plainly choosing the 5 best talents that come to mind, or just your 5 favorite basketball players of all time? Or are you choosing with respect to concept, system, and chemistry? Because in order for your all-time starting five to actually be considered the best, they would need to win theoretical games. Or else, what good is a starting five if the pieces don't work with one another? Unlike the 2022 Lakers, team fit and player chemistry are crucial factors in the NBA, and honestly, any sport in general, because they greatly influence a team's overall performance, success, and the ability to compete at the highest level, which is a component that completely gets ignored whenever these hypothetical lineups are created by fans and players. But at least this is where some of the more rational all-time starting fives come from some NBA players, unlike the ones that we covered thus far in the video. For example, when asked to list his all-time starting five, in his most recent response to this question, Steph's picks were Magic Johnson, Kobe Bryant, Michael Jordan, Tim Duncan, and Shaquille O'Neal. Okay, on paper, you're not arguing with that team, but this is where very pointed questions like, would Kobe Bryant and Michael Jordan actually fit on the court together? Two gunners, two ball-dominant scorers with alpha dog mentality. Wouldn't that clash? In today's NBA, we'd all agree that two guys of this makeup on the same team are a bad fit. But would we feel the same way with Mike and Kobe as teammates in a do-or-die game? These two are so spectacular that they might have just found a way to make it work. But still, it's a question worth asking. And interestingly enough, James Harden had nearly the same lineup as Steph Curry. The only difference, James Harden went with LeBron as his point guard instead of Magic Johnson, because his previous all-time starting five that he listed just months before the lineup that we just saw was a whole lot different. And you could argue his previous picks would have worked better as a team. In 2022, Steph's five players included himself, Magic Johnson, Michael Jordan, Dirk Nowitzki, and Shaquille O'Neal. And his reasoning was actually quite calculating, saying, I'm at the PG, I'm going with Magic, and we'll play hybrid guards. You got Jordan, then you got Dirk spacing the floor, shooting the ball, and you got one big man, the Diesel, holding it down. So that's a solid lineup, I think. So is this team sexier than his team with MJ and Kobe? Not exactly. But hypothetically speaking, who's to argue that this team wouldn't work better on the court? With a space-eating big with Shaq, a stretch forward in Dirk, and he wouldn't interfere with Shaq's space down low, a true point guard and master facilitator in Magic, and two bona fide scoring machines in Steph and MJ. But believe it or not, I think I came across the only NBA player that offered his own all-time starting five and considered all things like fit, chemistry, ego, play styles, and unity. So we might actually have a winner. But again, you be the judge. Just recently, Draymond Green tried his hand at dwarfing every other hypothetical all-time starting five with an impressive blend of talent, fit, and five players that would get the absolute best out of each other. Say what you want about Draymond, but you cannot argue that the man knows hoops like the back of his hand. Draymond's lineup wasn't anything out of the blue or out of the ordinary. I just personally felt that the combination of talent would work almost perfectly. It goes Steph, LeBron, MJ, Tim Duncan, and Shaq. You have an elite facilitator in LeBron, a scorer who can excel off the ball in Steph, a late game takeover player in Michael Jordan, a versatile stretch four with a touch from mid-range in Tim Duncan, and the greatest interior force in NBA history with Shaq. Roles are defined. No one steps on each other's toes. Each player gets their shine, therefore creating their own. I think this seamless fit has the best talent that you can find. So who's arguing with that lineup? Well, everyone has their own way of creating their all-time starting five, whether it's five of your favorite players or just picking the best of the best at each position. I, my friends, look at it to a greater extent. And along with sharing the opinions of active NBA players and retired legends, the point of me making this video of one of the most contested conversation among basketball fans and players alike. But even with that being said, whether you happen to agree with my assessment, the truth is, just like 99.9% of debates in sports, we'll never know. All we can do as faithful Hoops fans is kick back and talk about some of the most riveting what-ifs and hypotheticals in basketball. Now, I went on and on. You You even heard opinions of guys who actually played. But now it's your turn. Tell me your all-time starting 5 that you'd pick for one game to save your life. I can't wait to hear some of those.